It all began in one of those carefully manicured suburban neighborhoods, where every lawn looked like it had been trimmed by the same gardener. Every flower bed had been chosen from the same catalog, and every driveway was pressure washed on the exact same weekend. This was the kind of neighborhood where conformity was prized above all else, where homeowners' associations ruled with clipboards and violation slips, and where even something as small as a garden gnome could trigger a full-scale neighborhood scandal. At the center of this quiet, picture-perfect suburb stood a man who was not particularly rebellious, not known for causing trouble, and not someone who sought conflict. He was just a homeowner who had chosen this neighborhood because it promised safety, community, and well-kept surroundings. His house looked much like the others: beige siding, white trim, shutters that had been painted only after submitting an official request and waiting for HOA approval. On the surface, he blended right in. But sometimes it isn't the big things that spark neighborhood drama. Sometimes it's the smallest detail that sets off a chain of events nobody could have predicted. In this case, that detail was a mailbox. The mailbox wasn't even new. It had been standing for years, an ordinary post with a black metal box on top, slightly weathered, but functional. The red flag worked, the door closed securely, and it served its single purpose: to hold letters and packages. For most people, that would have been enough, but not for Karen. Karen was the HOA president, and she was a woman who saw the neighborhood not as a collection of families and lives, but as a living brochure for suburban perfection. She believed that every detail reflected on her personally. A slightly crooked trash can on the curb embarrassed her. A lawn with a single patch of crabgrass made her feel like the entire street was in decline. And when her eyes landed on her neighbor's modest, aging mailbox, she saw something she could not tolerate. To her, it was an eyesore. The first notice came in the mail, folded neatly with HOA letterhead and stern wording. It declared that the mailbox was in violation of neighborhood standards for being faded and slightly dented. It demanded immediate replacement or repainting. For most people, this would have been an annoyance. For him, it was bewildering. The mailbox wasn't falling over, it wasn't broken, it wasn't even unusual. But in Karen's eyes, it was unacceptable. At first, he ignored it. He figured it was just Karen nitpicking, another example of her tendency to invent problems when none existed. But Karen did not let go of things easily. The second notice came within a week, this time with a warning of fines if the issue was not addressed. And soon after, Karen herself appeared at the property, standing at the curb, arms crossed, staring at the mailbox like it was a personal insult. What Karen did not realize, however, was that her obsession with the mailbox had stirred something in him. A quiet resistance began to build. He had never been one for open rebellion, but there was something infuriating about being told that a perfectly serviceable mailbox wasn't good enough for someone else's vision of uniformity. He could have simply repainted it. He could have bought another generic black box from the hardware store, but instead he decided to do something else. At first it was only a thought, a mischievous idea sparked by Karen's persistence. If she thought the current mailbox was too ugly, too old, or too out of place, what would she do if it was replaced by something far more outrageous, something so big and bold that she couldn't possibly ignore it? What if instead of erasing the problem, he magnified it? The more Karen pressed, the stronger the idea grew. Each violation notice wasn't a deterrent, it was fuel. Each glance Karen threw toward his property was a reminder that she believed she had authority over even the smallest detail of his home. And with each reminder, his plan began to solidify. One Saturday morning, as neighbors quietly mowed their lawns and Karen herself was trimming her hedges with her usual precision, he drove his pickup truck into the driveway loaded with lumber, concrete mix, and metal brackets. Curious eyes peeked out from behind curtains as he unloaded supplies. People whispered. They had learned long ago that when Karen disapproved of something, the safest thing to do was to distance themselves. But whispers spread quickly. Construction began. First came the foundation, a deep hole dug at the curb, filled with gravel and cement. Then the post, which wasn't a modest wooden stake like every other mailbox in the neighborhood, but a thick, towering beam that rose higher than anyone thought necessary. By the end of the first day, the post alone reached over 10 feet into the air. Neighbors slowed their walks to stare. Karen marched over twice, demanding explanations, but he continued his work without a word. By the second day, the mailbox itself was mounted at the very top, perched like a crown. Shiny and metallic, it reflected the sunlight, glinting in the eyes of anyone passing by. The flag was oversized too, a bright red triangle so large it looked more like a sail than a simple signal for outgoing mail. The final touch came in the form of decorative trim, polished metal rings that wrapped the post like jewelry. When it was finished, the mailbox stood a full 12 feet tall. It was absurd, it was magnificent, it was everything Karen had not wanted. The neighborhood buzzed with gossip. Some thought it was hilarious, others thought it was reckless, but no one could deny that it was still technically a mailbox and technically functional. Mail carriers grumbled, but agreed to deliver to it, since nothing in the official postal regulations said a mailbox couldn't be 12 feet tall. Karen, on the other hand, was livid. Her face turned red every time she walked past it. Her hedge trimmers trembled in her hands as she glared at the gleaming tower. She stormed into HOA meetings with photographs, waving them around as though the mailbox were a personal attack on her leadership. But the more she protested, the more the community whispered. Some thought she was overreacting, some quietly applauded the bold defiance, and some began to grow tired of Karen's endless crusades over things that, in the grand scheme of life, mattered very little. The man who built the mailbox, however, didn't brag. He didn't boast. He simply went about his days watching as Karen unraveled in front of everyone. His silent rebellion stood at the edge of his property, a symbol of quiet defiance, and a constant reminder to Karen that sometimes the harder you push, the bigger the pushback becomes. As the weeks passed, the mailbox took on a life of its own. Children laughed when they saw it. Visitors from other neighborhoods slowed their cars to get a better look. Someone even posted a photo of it online, where it quickly spread, gaining attention far beyond the quiet suburban streets. What began as a petty HOA dispute was transforming into something larger, something that caught the imagination of people who had never even set foot in the neighborhood. But Karen wasn't finished. She wasn't the type to admit defeat, and the taller the mailbox stood, the more determined she became to bring it down. She began filing complaints not just with the HOA, but with the city. She called code enforcement. She tried to argue that it was unsafe, that it violated height restrictions, that it posed a danger to drivers and pedestrians alike. Each time, officials investigated, and each time they found that, while unusual, the mailbox didn't break any explicit rules. Karen's frustration grew into desperation. She doubled down at meetings, she knocked on neighbors' doors, and she attempted to rally support for stricter HOA rules that would prevent such outrages in the future. But as she grew more frantic, the neighborhood began to fracture. Some were on her side, nodding along with her speeches. Others quietly sympathized with the homeowner who had been pushed too far, and in between were those who simply enjoyed the show, waiting to see what would happen next. By now, the mailbox was more than just a piece of wood and metal. It was a symbol of resistance, a reminder that not every demand had to be met, not every rule had to be followed without question. And as Karen escalated her fight, it was clear that the battle was no longer about a simple mailbox. It was about power, control, and who truly got to decide what a neighborhood should look like. The mailbox stood tall, glinting in the sunlight, casting a long shadow over the street. And as the first chapter of this story drew to a close, the lines were clearly drawn. On one side stood Karen, fuming and determined, ready to drag the fight into every legal corner she could find. On the other side stood the homeowner, calm and steady, letting the mailbox speak louder than he ever could. The stage was set, the neighborhood was divided, and the battle over a mailbox was about to become much bigger than anyone had ever imagined. The 12-foot mailbox had already made waves in the neighborhood, but Chapter 2 of this story is where its significance truly began to unfold. What had started as a localized dispute, a petty skirmish between one stubborn homeowner and one even more stubborn HOA president, was about to ripple far beyond the picket fences of their suburban enclave. In the weeks that followed its completion, the mailbox stood tall like a sentinel at the edge of the property. Sunlight glinted off its polished surface during the day, and at night, the moonlight caught its edges, casting eerie shadows on the street below. Delivery drivers chuckled when they saw it. Children giggled and pointed as they walked past with their parents. Teenagers stopped on their bikes to take selfies with it, and then came the first viral photo. It was taken by a teenager from the next neighborhood over. He snapped a picture of himself standing beneath the towering mailbox, reaching his arms upward in mock disbelief at its ridiculous height. He posted it online with a caption poking fun at suburban rules and HOA nonsense. Within a few hours, the post began gathering likes. Within a day, it had thousands of shares. By the end of the week, the mailbox wasn't just a neighborhood oddity. It was an internet sensation. Karen hated every second of it. Where the homeowner saw the mailbox as a clever rebuttal to arbitrary rules, Karen saw it as a personal humiliation. Every share, every meme, every comment about the world's tallest suburban mailbox felt like a jab at her authority. Her face grew tighter, her voice sharper, as she doubled her efforts to bring it down. She started with the HOA board. At the next meeting, she presented slides of the mailbox, declaring it a blight, an embarrassment, and a danger. She insisted that new bylaws be written, ones that explicitly banned oversized and disruptive structures on private property. Some board members nodded politely, others looked uncomfortable, but the homeowner quietly sat in the back row, knowing that any rules written now couldn't apply retroactively. His mailbox was already there, and unless she could prove it violated existing rules, it was untouchable. Karen didn't take that well. Soon after, official letters began to arrive, not from the HOA this time, but from city offices. She had filed complaints with zoning officials, claiming the mailbox violated sightline rules for drivers. When that failed, she called the fire department, insisting the structure posed a hazard. When they shrugged it off, she tried the post office itself, writing letters demanding the United States Postal Service intervene. But each inquiry ended the same way. The mailbox was strange, yes, even inconvenient, but it was technically functional and legally compliant. The harder Karen pushed, the more resistance she encountered. And the more resistance she encountered, the more unhinged her crusade appeared. Neighbors began whispering, not about the mailbox anymore, but about Karen. Some thought she was obsessed, others thought she was embarrassing herself, and a few began to quietly resent the way she consumed every HOA meeting with her vendetta. Meanwhile, the mailbox's fame grew. Local news stations caught wind of the story. A reporter showed up one sunny afternoon, cameraman in tow, asking for footage of the now infamous mailbox. They filmed segments showing the towering structure, interviewed amused neighbors, and even captured a quick shot of Karen scowling in the background as she tried to shoo them away. The news clip aired that evening, and suddenly the mailbox wasn't just an internet meme, it was a local landmark. Cars began slowing as they drove past, tourists snapping photos out of windows. A family even parked nearby to take group pictures with it, as if it were a roadside attraction. And with each new set of visitors, Karen's temper flared hotter. It didn't help that the homeowner leaned into the absurdity. Without a word to anyone, he began small, harmless additions that made the mailbox stand out even more. A solar-powered spotlight at the base illuminated it at night. A decorative weather vane spun lazily at the top, catching the sun during the day. Once he even strung a strand of holiday lights around it, not out of seasonality, but out of sheer mischief. Karen nearly lost her composure entirely when she spotted the lights. She stormed up and down the street, clutching printed copies of HOA bylaws, demanding support from neighbors. But by now something had shifted in the community. Where once Karen's authority had gone largely unchallenged, people were beginning to question whether her obsession was doing more harm than the mailbox ever could. Some residents whispered that they admired the homeowner's quiet defiance. Others simply found joy in the spectacle, and in a neighborhood that had long prided itself on strict conformity, there was something liberating about seeing one house break the mold so flamboyantly. But Karen wasn't done. When local efforts failed, she reached higher, petitioning state officials, writing letters to council members, even attempting to frame the mailbox as a violation of public safety standards. None of it worked. Each denial only deepened her determination. The homeowner, on the other hand, remained calm. He never raised his voice, never retaliated openly, never even directly confronted Karen. His rebellion was passive but powerful, embodied in the towering mailbox that stood day after day, week after week, refusing to be moved. And as the weeks stretched into months, something remarkable happened. The mailbox began to symbolize more than one man's quiet resistance. Online, it became a rallying point for people everywhere who had dealt with overbearing HOAs, nosy neighbors, or petty rules. Memes circulated with captions about standing tall against unfair authority. Posts racked up thousands of comments from strangers who felt vindicated just knowing someone had fought back. What had begun as a neighborhood nuisance in Karen's eyes had become, in the eyes of the internet, a monument to stubborn independence. Of course, Karen saw none of that nuance. To her, the mailbox was still just an insult, a scar on the neighborhood she had worked so hard to control. She could feel her grip on authority slipping, her carefully cultivated image of suburban perfection unraveling. And in her mind, there was only one option left: escalation. She began speaking with lawyers. She brought legal language into HOA meetings, hinting at lawsuits and court orders. She threatened to drag the fight into litigation, convinced that once it reached a courtroom, the mailbox would be deemed unacceptable. But in preparing her case, Karen made a crucial mistake. So focused was she on tearing down the mailbox that she failed to realize how public perception had turned against her. Neighbors who once remained silent were now frustrated by the endless meetings, the constant complaints, the way every neighborhood email chain devolved into arguments about one mailbox. Her name became a punchline in whispers and online comments alike. The homeowner, however, saw the shift clearly. He understood that Karen's battle had already spiraled beyond logic, and though he didn't relish conflict, he knew that if she dragged him into court, the spectacle would only grow larger. The internet that had cheered on his mailbox would not hesitate to cheer on the trial of the century over suburban pettiness. By the end of Chapter 2, the neighborhood found itself on the edge of something bigger than anyone had expected. Karen, unwilling to let go, prepared to take the fight into a courtroom, armed with binders of complaints and photographs. The homeowner, calm but resolute, prepared himself as well, knowing that whatever happened next would not only decide the fate of his 12-foot mailbox, but also settle once and for all who truly controlled the neighborhood: the HOA, or the people who actually lived there. The stage was set for a legal showdown, one that promised embarrassment, spectacle, and perhaps the ultimate backfire of Karen's relentless campaign. And as the sun set behind the rainbow-colored glint of the mailbox's metal frame, the neighborhood held its breath, waiting to see what would come next. By the time the sun rose on the third week of mailbox drama, the entire neighborhood had transformed into a theater, and every morning was another act in a play no one could stop watching. The towering mailbox, 12 feet of polished wood and shining steel, had already become something of a roadside attraction. Cars slowed as they drove by. Joggers made deliberate loops past the curb. Families walking their dogs stopped for photos. Children posed with wide smiles, pointing at the absurd creation. What had once been a quiet suburban cul-de-sac now resembled the setting of an ongoing documentary. Neighbors whispered at block parties, speculated at backyard fences, and chuckled behind closed curtains. All eyes were on the gleaming tower standing tall by the curb, and more importantly, on the escalating feud that surrounded it. Karen, however, had stopped whispering. Her frustration had grown into a force of its own. Every time she saw the mailbox, she clenched her jaw tight enough to ache. Every time she returned home, she parked her SUV directly across from it and sat for a moment, glaring at the polished emblem that mocked her authority. For her, it wasn't just a mailbox anymore. It was a monument to defiance. And for the homeowner, that was exactly the point. The oversized mailbox had been carefully designed not only to comply with every HOA regulation, but also to exaggerate them. Its base was perfectly aligned with property boundaries, its materials fully compliant with community guidelines, and its proportions, while unusual, technically within the allowances of custom craftsmanship. Every detail had been researched, checked, and rechecked before construction began. It was, by all definitions, legal. The HOA board had no choice but to acknowledge that, and though Karen's complaints kept arriving, they were met each time with the same matter-of-fact response: no rules had been broken. But while the board's silence infuriated her, the mailbox's growing popularity enraged her even more. Soon, photos of the mailbox had spread beyond the neighborhood. Social media posts showcasing the mailbox tower began circulating. Local community groups shared the images with captions like "Suburban Petty War at its Finest" and "HOA Drama Monument." The story even caught the attention of local journalists who thrived on light-hearted neighborhood spectacles. Within days, a small news crew had shown up, eager to film the 12-foot oddity and get sound bites from amused neighbors. The coverage only made things worse for Karen. Her repeated attempts to frame the mailbox as an eyesore or safety hazard were drowned out by laughter, amusement, and support for the homeowner's creativity. The more she insisted it violated the spirit of the community, the more people rallied around the fact that it didn't violate the rules. The irony was that, in her relentless attempt to eliminate a simple mailbox, she had created a symbol bigger than herself. The battle had become public entertainment, and she was cast as the villain in a story the whole town now followed. As weeks turned to months, the 12-foot mailbox settled into the landscape like a permanent fixture. Its shadow stretched across the driveway in the mornings, and in the evenings, the setting sun caught its metallic trim, making it glow like a beacon. The homeowner even added small decorative touches: seasonal flowers planted neatly around the base, festive ribbons during holidays, and at one point, a subtle solar-powered light that illuminated the mailbox at night. Each addition followed the rules. Each addition escalated Karen's fury. Her strategy shifted. She began petitioning the HOA for a special amendment to regulate mailbox dimensions more strictly. She canvassed the neighborhood, knocking on doors and pleading for signatures. She warned of a slippery slope, insisting that if one neighbor could build a 12-foot mailbox, another could build a 20-foot fence or a statue of a flamingo the size of a garage. She painted pictures of absurd chaos, of a neighborhood spiraling out of control unless swift action was taken. But her efforts backfired. Many neighbors, though normally disinterested in HOA politics, were reluctant to support any rule that might undo what had become a source of pride and amusement. They had grown fond of the mailbox. It was a story they told visitors, a landmark that set their street apart. Why would they give that up just to appease one person's complaints? Karen managed to collect some signatures, but not enough. The board dragged its feet on her request, reluctant to stir more controversy, and so the mailbox stood, untouched and unchallenged. The homeowner, meanwhile, watched all of this unfold with quiet satisfaction. He had never intended for things to escalate so far, but once they had, he leaned into it. Each news article, each viral photo, and each frustrated outburst from Karen only cemented his victory. He didn't need to say anything. The mailbox spoke for itself. Eventually, Karen realized she could not win. The HOA would not intervene, the neighbors would not support her, and the homeowner would not back down. The more she fought, the more isolated she became, and so she stopped attending HOA meetings. She stopped writing complaint letters. She even stopped making eye contact when she passed the mailbox. Her SUV no longer lingered in front of it. She had been defeated not by argument, but by endurance. The mailbox, once a target of hostility, became a quiet reminder of resilience. It remained tall and bright at the edge of the property, unchanged except for the decorations that rotated with the seasons. Neighbors came to accept it as part of the landscape, and eventually, its spectacle softened into normalcy. Children who had once giggled at its absurd height grew used to seeing it on their way to school. Adults stopped taking photos and started walking past it without much thought. But for those who remembered the feud, the mailbox was more than just a mailbox. It was a monument to a battle fought not with words or fists, but with patience, compliance, and creativity. The homeowner had won not because he bent the rules, but because he mastered them. He had turned the strict limitations of the HOA into a canvas, and in doing so, exposed the absurdity of overbearing authority. What began as an ordinary mailbox complaint ended as a lasting neighborhood legend. And as years passed, stories about the mailbox continued to circulate. New neighbors, curious about the towering structure, would eventually hear the tale. It always began the same way. You see that mailbox? That's because Karen complained. The legacy endured, long after the anger faded. In the end, the mailbox stood not just as a victory for one homeowner, but as a reminder to everyone who passed by. Sometimes the best way to fight petty control is with creativity, patience, and just a little bit of humor. The battle had ended, the neighborhood had moved on, and the 12-foot mailbox remained quietly towering over the street, a permanent symbol of resilience against unnecessary control. And with that, the story closed. Not with another argument, not with another complaint, but with the silent, steady presence of a mailbox that had outlasted